some of the Jewish feasts and festivals that are in Scripture. We've been doing this series, doing them. I know if you're watching these as I'm putting them out, because this is live, it's been a little while since I've done one, so these are behind, but I still wanted to have them up on the channel just for record's sake and for future reference. So today we're talking about Purim, the Jewish holiday of Purim. And Purim generally takes place sometime in March. It always does, actually. And this past year, it was March 16th and 17th. It's like a weekend thing. And so we as a family did our first Purim celebration. We've never done that before. And it was kind of interesting because what you do with Purim, the traditional way to celebrate it is you make cookies. And the cookies are these interesting little pastries that have like a triangular shape. And people say it's supposed to look like the hat that Haman, the villain of the story of Esther, wore, because Purim is the feast that comes from the biblical book of Esther. And they, in the book, actually mention that we should start doing this feast. Oh, excuse me. I'll call that person back. But we start doing the biblical feast. And what we see is, so it's not one of the original Levitical feasts, but it comes before the time of Christ. And so that's why we're studying it, because it has to do with Jesus's method of discipleship, because Jesus probably celebrated Purim to remember Esther. Now, what you do is you read the story of Esther and remind you and your children, your family, your church of that story. And so what we did as a family was we tried to make those cookies. We experimented with those. Kim did a good job for her first time. We did more with wontons because it's the same basic idea. Because those cookies, what you do is you put like something sweet, jelly or something inside of them. Kim made something very similar to that. And we put both savory things and sweet things in it, because the whole purpose of these cookies, other than the hat thing, is really about the hiddenness of God. Because God is not mentioned in the book of Esther at all. It doesn't come up. He doesn't speak. He doesn't do anything. It almost seems like a book that is separate from other types of books of Scripture because of that. But he is present in every verse, in his invisible qualities, in his silent sovereignty. And really, this has great implication for us and how we live our lives when we sometimes feel like God doesn't see what we're doing. But in reality, he is invisibly controlling and watching over us. So it's a beautiful book for that reason, and a great holiday to remind ourselves of, even when things seem mundane, hidden in the normal is the miraculous. And so I just wanted to, with you, just for a moment, think about the book of Esther and how God does show up in kind of invisible ways. So for my family with this, and we have kids, so we watched the VeggieTales Esther story, which is a great VeggieTales movie, and it helped the kids get the story. But in the scriptures, what I wanted to remind you of is in Esther chapter 1, you have the story of Vashti, the queen, being kicked out. She's having a party. The king is having a party. I think it's fair to say that both of them were parties that offended God. They were filled with idolatry and other sorts of sins. We get less details about Vashti's than we do about Xerxes, the king. But the idea is that they're both pagan celebrations. And it's interesting because the book begins with a pagan celebration and ends with a celebration of the people of God. So the king wants her to come to his party and do something. She refuses to go. And he is encouraged that you can't let her treat you like that. So he has her removed. And when she is removed, then a search has to happen to find a new queen. Now, this might just seem like the rantings of a arrogant king, but in reality, this is the hand of God moving Vashti out and Esther in, which is the next thing that happens, is that Esther is selected amongst all the people of Persia. She is selected to be queen. And it really is this strange, bringing in, and she spends time in a harem and she spends time preparing for the king. And it is, I don't want us to have this idea that it's some sort of fairy tale story. She was kidnapped and taken into a harem. It was not a fun experience. And yet God in his sovereignty used that experience to bless others. And then there is this plot against the Jewish people. We're going through this fast. The plot against the Jewish people by Haman, the villain. There's a lot of other details, but these are just the big, like, story plot lines that you can see God's hand. A lot of little ways to see it, but these are big ones. Haman comes against the Jewish people, and you might think of that as like against God, but actually, I would ask you to consider that God would actually move on Haman to come against his own God's people, so that Haman can be judged, because Haman is a blasphemer and an enemy of God. And so, in his own crime and his own project to destroy God's people, he implicates himself and causes judgment. This too is God's sovereignty and his control. So he also, as the plot against the Jews took place, Esther is reluctant, but eventually she steps in. She goes and sees the king, and there's some interesting moments there where she was in danger and she was taking great risks. But ultimately, she has these banquets, and she invites Haman and the king to them. And over time, over a few days, she has these banquets and gains their trust and gains their interest. And then finally, she explains to the king, this is what is going on. People are trying to kill my people. So someone has a plot against my people, me, myself, and my families, and all these things. And the king says, who is it? And she says, this is the man Haman. And the king is infuriated. He has his own little wrath that comes against Haman. And God uses Xerxes to protect the Jewish people. He really uses Esther to convince Xerxes to protect the Jewish people, and ultimately to judge Haman for his blasphemy and his violence and his hatred of God and his hatred of God's people. So from the beginning even of the story, God's invisible sovereignty frames everything that takes place. And it's actually a beautiful thing to see how God can be present and powerful and yet silent. It's good for us to remember that. So hope you're doing well. God bless you. Talk to you soon.